Today, we spend the hour with the director of a groundbreaking new documentary called The Act of Killing. The film is set in Indonesia, where beginning in 1965, the military and paramilitary slaughtered up to 1 million Indonesians after overthrowing the government. That military was backed by the United States and led by General Suharto, who would rule Indonesia for decades. There's been no Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As the film says, Indonesia is a country where the killers are to this day celebrated as heroes. A key figure in the film is Anwar Congo, who killed hundreds, if not 1,000 people with his own hands and is now revered as a founding father of an active right-wing paramilitary organization. Well, director Joshua Oppenheimer spent more than 8 years interviewing the Indonesian death squad leaders. And in The Act of Killing, he works with them to reenact the real-life killings in the style of American movies the men love to watch. This includes classic Hollywood gangster movies and lavish musical numbers. The film is remarkable. Now, the issue of the Indonesian military's brutality is no stranger to our Democracy Now! Audience. In 1990 and 91, I traveled to Indonesian-occupied East Timor. I went there with reporter Alan Nairn. There, we witnessed a massacre by the U.S.-backed Indonesian military. That was the Indonesian military occupying a foreign land. This film deals with the Indonesian military's murder of its own people. Well, this week, I sat down with Joshua Oppenheimer to talk about The Act of Killing, which he directed with Christine Sin, and an Indonesian co-director who remains anonymous for fear of retribution for making the film, as does much of the Indonesian film crew. Its executive producers are Werner Herzog and Errol Morris. The Act of Killing opens today in New York City at the landmark Sunshine Cinema and comes to Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. July 26th and to theaters nationwide. This is a clip from the film's trailer.
Cut. You acted so well, but you can stop crying now.
War crimes are defined by the winners. I'm a winner.
Have mercy on me.
Honestly, I never expected it to look this brutal. I can't do that again. I did this to so many people. Have I sinned?
That's the trailer for The Act of Killing, a new film that has been 8 years in the making. Its director, Josh Oppenheimer, joins us now in studio. Longtime filmmaker who's worked for over a decade with militias, death squads, their victims, to examine political violence and the public imagination. The Act of Killing's co-director remains anonymous. Its executive producers are Werner Herzog and Errol Morris. Joshua Oppenheimer, welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you so much.
This is an astounding film. It is a masterpiece. We'll talk about whether it can be called a documentary. I wanted to ask you if you could just give us the context of what happened. Many people who are watching or listening right now have never even heard of Suharto. So explain to us what happened in 1965.
So in 1965, the left-leaning government of Sukarno, it was basically a socialist, non-aligned government. Sukarno was the founder of independent Indonesia, was overthrown in a military coup that led to the dictatorship, the 32-year dictatorship of Suharto, and then an ongoing corruption that continues to today. When Sukarno was overthrown, the military swiftly went after everybody who was opposed to the new regime and accused them of being communists. Of course, some of them were communists. Indonesia had the largest communist party that was committed to achieving political power through the democratic process. They were an unarmed, non-revolutionary communist party. So they were accused, but also Indonesian women's movement, the entire trade union movement, intellectuals, teachers, and the ethnic Chinese, and also land reform advocates. So within a year, somewhere between 500,000 and 2.5 million people were killed in what was really one of the very largest genocides in our history. And it was reported in the United States as good news. It was reported in the New York Times and Time magazine fairly accurately in terms of the death tolls, but with headlines like "A Gleam of Light in Asia," "The West's Best News for Years in Asia." So inevitably these events have been forgotten in the West, because how do you remember the killing of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people, as good news? It doesn't make sense as a story, and so we forget it.
Can you talk about the U.S. role at the time, something that is very much, if people even know about what happened here, it's a story that isn't as well known?
Yes. The U.S. was, and the West in general, particularly the U.K., probably Australia, were very much involved with supporting and encouraging the genocide. The U.S. provided money, it provided some weapons, it provided radios so that the army could coordinate the killings across this vast archipelago that is Indonesia. They also provided death lists of thousands of names of fairly prominent public figures, leftist leaders of unions, intellectuals. So it wasn't meaningful intelligence, but it was a clear signal: we want these people dead.
And these are political officers within the U.S. Embassy handing over names of people, and they were crossing off the names as they were killed.
Yeah, one of them was a guy called Bob Martins, from the former State Department official who, when we met him, was living in Bethesda, Maryland. And another was the CIA Deputy Station Chief Joe Lazarski, living in suburban Virginia. They were handing over these lists of names. Basically, I remember, actually, Bob Martins was on the record in 1990. He was interviewed by a journalist called Kathy Cadane, and he said, "I may have blood on my hands, but sometimes that's a good thing." And the whole beyond that list of names, who were people the Indonesian army certainly knew about, the whole message from the United States was, we want you not to just go after a few political leaders who are opposed to the new regime, the leaders of the Communist Party, for example. We want you to go after the entire grassroots base of the Indonesian left. It's as if one day everybody affiliated with the Democratic Party and everybody registered as a Democrat was hunted down and killed or put in concentration camps. That's essentially what happened in Indonesia in 1965 with Western support.
Let's talk about your film. You're giving the political backdrop. Talk about how you discovered the people in your film, and begin with the name, because that very much tells us the story, the act of killing and its various meanings.
Yeah, the act of killing is, of course, the title of the film. It has several meanings. Of course, it can refer to the commission of the crime of killing, or commission of the deed of killing, which it's worth pointing out is fundamentally a human act. We have really no other species, except for a couple of the higher primates, kill each other. Human beings kill each other, and we kill each other en masse and again and again and again through our history. So there's a sense that the film looks at what does it mean for human beings to kill? What are the consequences of killing? Why do we kill? What are the consequences on our societies for impunity around killing? How do we justify killing? Through the stories we tell. And then in Medan, in the capital of North Sumatra, the largest city in Sumatra, the third largest city in Indonesia, a city of about the size perhaps of Chicago, the army recruited in 1965 its civilian death squad members from the ranks of movie theater gangsters, preman bioskop in Indonesian. These men were gangsters. They were part of a mafia that was running all sorts of criminal rackets, protection rackets, smuggling, illegal logging, prostitution rings, and so forth. But they were using as their base of operations movie theaters, and they were selling movie theater tickets on the black market as a kind of small side source of income. And they loved the movies. And because they were hanging out in them, so they developed a whole culture around the movies, a whole kind of youth gang culture around the movies. And at the time, the head of the American Motion Picture Association of Indonesia, a man named Bill Palmer, was believed by ordinary Indonesians to have been plotting a coup to overthrow the president of Indonesia, Sukarno. He had a villa outside, the distributor of American movies in Indonesia had a villa outside of Jakarta in which they found a memorandum, which may or may not have been a forgery, we don't know, signed by the British ambassador, Gilchrist, again, could have been a forgery, but it was discovered and it was a coup attempt against President Sukarno. So everybody had reason to think in Indonesia at the time that the guy bringing American movies to Indonesia, Hollywood movies to Indonesia, was in fact a CIA officer and planning to overthrow their founding father, if you like. So there was a boycott, broad-based boycott of American movies in 1964-65, and the movie theater gangsters hated this. So the army recruited them because they knew they had a proven capacity for violence because they were criminals, gangsters, and they knew that they hated the Indonesian left already and could be easily mobilized to do their dirty work in attacking the left once the killing started. So the movie theater gangsters were recruited to form these death squads, and as it happened, because of their love of movies, and because the army had placed the offices where they were killing people directly across the street from the cinemas so that it was convenient for them to leave the cinema, walk across the street, and torture and kill people, they would torture and kill people in ways inspired by American movies. And the main character in the film, Anwar Congo, describes coming out of the movies, The Midnight Show, an Elvis Presley musical, for example, dancing his way across the street and killing happily. So acting was always part of the act of killing for the men in the film. It was a way of distancing themselves from the horrific deeds they were doing. And, of course, then in my film I have them, or I allow them to reenact what they've done, to dramatize what they've done in whatever ways they wish. It's worth perhaps in a moment going into how I came to that method. But so the act of killing has this double and even triple meaning, how acting was always part of the act of killing, how in the film they act out their memories of killing. And finally, it's worth remembering that the act of killing needn't refer simply to the act of killing human beings. It can, as it does in the case, as the act of killing demonstrates, I hope, as the film demonstrates, it also refers to the act of killing ideas, hope, community, solidarity, and sort of our common humanity.
Filmmaker Joshua Oppenheimer. He spent more than 8 years interviewing Indonesian death squad leaders. And in his new film, The Act of Killing, he works with them to reenact the real-life killings in the style of American movies the men love to watch. This includes classic Hollywood gangster movies and lavish musical numbers. The Act of Killing opens today in New York City at the landmark Sunshine Cinema and then moves on to Los Angeles and Washington and the rest of the country. We'll continue our interview in a moment.